So, we're going to talk today about the culture of power and governance of Pakistan, 1947 to 2008. This is my book, which was first published in 2010, and since then it's been through multiple print runs and it's still available in the market. The book is basically about the evolution of the state in Pakistan and the historical experience of that state. So, when we try to understand the evolution of Pakistan as a state, we need to reflect upon the broader political and administrative history of South Asia. Before proceeding with this historical background, we first need to briefly define certain terms that are used in this particular book. The first of these terms is something that I call the continental bureaucratic empire. And this is a kind of state or a kind of regime that has certain qualities. The first of these qualities is that in a continental bureaucratic empire, the ruler claims that the state is essentially a vast estate. The ruler claims that the state is, in a way, the property of his regime or he himself. From this, the ruler requires help in the management of his estate. So this leads to the creation of a class of servants that are there to enforce the writ of the ruler. And these servants, which can be military or bureaucratic or religious in nature, or they can also be local notables that are co-opted by the ruler, they are in effect the ruling class of a bureaucratic empire. So in a bureaucratic empire, number one, the ruler is the owner of the country, and number two, the ruling class of that empire are servants of that ruler. These servants are typically organized into hierarchies, and the ruler uses the people at the top of a hierarchy to effectively rule over the rest of the empire. Now, this type of state is typically legitimized by some kind of divine sanction or some kind of dominant ideology. So it isn't enough that the ruler claims that they are the proprietor of the state. It isn't enough that the ruler's servants are the ruling class of the state. But the servants of the ruler and the ruler himself typically claim that the empire has some kind of divine sanction, and that this form of government that they are executing also has some kind of divine sanction. So the role of the priesthood or the role of the religious class is very important in terms of ensuring that the ruler has some kind of legitimacy in the eyes of the governed. And this legitimacy is normally derived from religion. Now, the other type of state that this study uses and conceptualizes is what I call a state of laws. And in a state of laws, there are many things that are different from a continental bureaucratic empire. The first is that in a state of laws, the state is not the property of the ruler, and there is some kind of distinction that is drawn between public and private property. The second thing that a state of laws possesses is that there is a class of autonomous individuals, sometimes an aristocracy, sometimes a leading body of eminent citizens organized into some kind of representative organ, which exercises a check on the power of the executive. As a result of this, in a state of laws, the third quality is of paramount importance. And that quality is that in a state of laws, as the name indicates, it is the law that is regarded as the ultimate sovereign. And that law can express itself formally in the sense of a constitution, It can also express itself informally or semi-formally, depending upon the context that we have in mind. Now, the state of laws is something which is not very widely prevalent in history. So you will find some examples of a state of laws in ancient Athens. You might argue that ancient Rome during the Republican period also falls into the category. And you might also argue that the city-states of the Italian Renaissance were possibly state of law type polities. And in our modern history, the British, and in particular the United Kingdom, might be considered to be the ultimate example of a state of laws, with dominant parliamentary institutions, an autonomous judiciary, and a ruling aristocracy that also co-opts wealthy commoners into a power structure that limits the authority of the executive. Now, regardless of whether a state is a bureaucratic empire or a state of laws, it will have some kind of a legitimizing ideology in place. And in this context, we are talking about the idiocratic complex of that state. So when we think about an idiocratic complex, we are thinking about all of those institutions, all of those mechanisms that are used to confer legitimacy upon the existing order. And this idiocratic complex can be directly owned by the state, as is often the case in bureaucratic empires. It can also be indirectly influenced by the government through various autonomous actors that nonetheless have a vested interest in the perpetuation of the particular regime. Now, in continental bureaucratic empires, the form of rule that typically exists is what I refer to as idiocratic arbitrary rule, in which you have a regime that claims to be legitimized by some kind of divine sanction and is therefore very difficult to lawfully oppose. And that regime rules a society in an arbitrary manner, which is to say that what the ruler or what the ruling class wish to be done, they don't really have to explain themselves or justify themselves or fear any real accountability for their actions. They are able to, in a sense, rule without any immediate fear of consequences. What happens when a continental bureaucratic state or empire experiments with various reforms rooted in the example of a state of laws? The result of that is what I call a legal democracy, which is to say a form of government in which the constitutional mechanisms of a state of laws are adopted, but these are grafted on top of a state machinery and a way of doing things which predate that particular reform. So here you have a tension between the formal aspiration, which is to have some kind of constitutionalism, and the informal reality of these states, which at best struggle to follow these norms that they want to aspire to. So taken together, I call this form of government a legal democracy, in the sense that it is lawful in the higher sense of the term, and it is democratic as well in many instances. So you have the paraphernalia, if you will, of a state of laws, elections, autonomous institutions, that sort of elaborate infrastructure is in place. But fundamentally, the spirit of a legal democracy remains that of an arbitrary rulership. Now, this brings us to the last definition, which is that of the culture of power. And in the culture of power, a good way to think about it is that power itself has its own culture. So the way people behave when they are in a position of authority, when they are in a position of power, is perhaps different than how they might act when they are not placed in a structure of that kind. When we think of the culture of power, we are thinking about the total behavior of those people who are in power, and we are also thinking about how other people in society react to those people when they interact with them, when they have to deal with them. So the rulers might be arbitrary, they might be self-seeking, they might be self-aggrandizing. The people might respond to this with a combination of flight, with a combination of apathy, with a combination of evasion, or with a combination of collusion and looking out for short-term gain.